Hi guys, this is the Sony A7 III and I've had it now for a week or so and I've tried it out a little bit. And this is not a review video because there are tons of great review videos out there already about this camera, so I'm skipping that. I just want to make a short video with my first impressions of this camera and my biggest surprises. I thought I knew everything about this camera before I purchased it, but I've learned a couple of things since I unboxed it, and I thought it could be interesting to you guys if you're thinking about maybe purchasing this camera to hear about my first impressions and what surprised me the most. So let's go. So I've been using the camera with both adapted lenses, Canon lenses such as the 135mm f2, a lens that I really love, and I've also been using it with the Samyang 35mm autofocus lens, which is pretty new and which I bought pretty recently and that I really love. And what surprised me actually about autofocus is not that it is super great, which it is, but that's not really a surprise. That's kind of why you buy this camera. And what surprised me the most was that autofocus is great not only with native lenses but also with adapted Canon lenses. And this is really impressive that with the Canon 135mm f2, the autofocus was kind of just as good as with native lenses, which surprised me a lot actually. So I mean, it locks on eyes and on faces and anything without a problem, and it's so easy to move the focus point with a joystick, and it's really nice. I can use Canon lenses just as if they were Sony lenses, and it works smoothly and perfectly. I tried it both with the Metabones and with the MC11 adapter from Sigma, and both of them work great, even though the Metabones adapter covers more lenses. I had a little bit of trouble with the Tamron lens on the MC11, and it worked perfectly with the Metabones. So this is surprise number one for me, that autofocus works so great on adapted lenses, and I love that so much because I use adapted lenses all the time, because the corresponding Sony glass either it doesn't exist or it is too expensive for me to want to purchase. So that's a great thing. Another great thing about the Sony A7 III is the viewfinder. What surprised me was that it is so big. The picture in the viewfinder is so large, so much larger than on the A7, the original A7 that I had before. And in the beginning it felt a little bit inconvenient because I wasn't used to it, but very soon I started appreciating it because it gives you a much better sense of how the picture will look, and above all, how the composition will look. And this is so nice. So something that might not look that important on paper, but in reality it makes the shooting experience completely different and heightened in some way. The large EVF, I really like it. A third thing that I was pleasantly surprised by was the dynamic range and the low light performance. It also maybe shouldn't come as a surprise, but the dynamic range is really something. It's actually quite a bit more than I expected, and combined with the in-body image stabilization, I mean, you can take pictures in almost complete darkness, like this one that I took in a museum the other day. There were no lights from windows or anything, and it was very dark. A picture like this I would never be able to take with my old camera, the Sony A7, but on the A7 III I could just use a very slow shutter speed, and I could just exposure compensate. I mean, it was shot actually on ISO 100, which is kind of crazy, and it still looks very good, I would say. And something actually I learned about this camera after I purchased it is that you need to be aware of as well, is that the sensor does not really work as in the old sensor on the Sony A7 and A7 II. On the old sensor, it didn't really matter what kind of ISO you used. So what I did all the time was I always shot at ISO 100 and then underexposed in a lot of cases, and then when I came home I just drew up the exposure in Lightroom, and that way I knew that I would never have more grain in the picture than what's necessary. I mean, if I would instead have had a little bit too high ISO when I shot, I could have had a lot of grain in the picture that wasn't really necessary. So that's why it was good in the case of Sony A7 and Sony A7 II to always underexpose a bit. But with the Sony A7 III, they have something called dual gain system, which means that when you shoot at higher ISOs like 1200 or 2000 or something like that, you actually get a much better performance if you use that ISO in low light than if you would be shooting at ISO 100 and then later draw up the exposure in Lightroom. So that's something to think about, and a habit that I have to change personally, to start shooting at the appropriate ISO at all times and not default to ISO 100 just for simplicity. And yeah, so all in all, super great dynamic range, and now we're getting pretty close to a camera that can shoot in almost complete darkness without no extra lights, and that's really quite something, and I love it because I like to shoot a lot in dark conditions. So those were a few good surprises, and I also had, unfortunately, 3 bad surprises that I will go into now. First of all, and this is kind of both bad and good, but mostly bad, the camera is really heavy. I mean, it's a lot heavier than the Sony A7. That was the first thing that I noticed when I picked up this camera, that it weighs a lot. But of course it's for good reasons. They have this new huge battery, which is now standard among the Sony cameras. And I mean, I love that the battery has such a good battery life, but I didn't really have a problem with the Sony A7 battery life, to be honest. But I understand that, I mean, for example, the in-body image stabilization, it requires more power. And also, of course, all the shooters coming over from the DSLRs, from Nikon and Canon, they are used to really good battery life, so I understand that they have to put in this huge battery. But it's kind of a little bit frustrating that the camera is so heavy now. I mean, one of the powers with the Sony system before, the Sony A7 series, was that you had such a small and lightweight camera, and now that's kind of gone. Even though, I mean, the camera is really small and it's more lightweight than most of the DSLRs, or I think like all of the DSLRs. But still, it's a little bit of a bad thing that it is so heavy, this camera. Before the release of the Sony A7 III, there were a lot of talk about banding issues, and this was something I was quite honestly a little bit afraid of, but at the same time I kind of understood that a company like Sony would never release a flagship, or well, not flagship, but like a serious camera like this with any of these issues left in it. I mean, that would just be unacceptable, and it will destroy their brand completely among professional photographers. But actually what surprised me was that I saw some of this banding issue, but it was not really a problem in reality, because I mean, this issue appears mostly when you're shooting in dark conditions and you have some lights either just outside the frame or like at the edges of the frame. Then you could in some cases see some light bands in the picture. But the thing is, when you are in a situation like this and you point the camera in just the direction where you can see this banding, I mean, it disappears in just like 2 seconds, and you never even, like, even if you, as I did, try to catch this band on a picture, it's kind of hard to do it because they go away so quickly once the camera adjusts to the new lighting condition. So in reality, it's not really a problem, not that I have experienced so far at least, and but it's still there. The issue is still there. And thing number 6 that was a little bit of a surprise to me was how pixely and flickery the viewfinder feels. This is also kind of a bad thing. Compared to the Sony A7, I think actually the viewfinder, the electronic viewfinder, has the same resolution, but it since it's so much bigger, you can actually see the pixels a lot more. In the Sony A7 it was kind of hard to even notice the pixels in the viewfinder, but on the A7 III you definitely notice them, and that is a little bit of a frustration for me. And that would be the only reason I think that I would maybe prefer the A7R III, which has or the A9 for that matter, which has a much better viewfinder. But still, I mean, the viewfinder is good, and the kind of flickering that noticed in the beginning is something you very quickly become used to, and something you very quickly stop thinking about. So maybe that was just like an adjustment issue from my old Sony A7. But if you're allergic to seeing pixels, if you're all retina on all your devices and you really hate seeing pixels, then maybe you should consider the A7R III or the A9 instead of the A7 III, because the viewfinder is a little bit pixely, and it was a little bit of a surprise to me actually, since the viewfinder on the A7 is so smooth. Anyways, that was my 6 biggest surprises with this Sony A7 III, and as I said in the beginning of this video, I've barely even used it so far, so I'm looking forward to discovering more of this camera and what it can do, but so far I really love it, and I'm so happy with my purchase. I mean, even though I mentioned that in some cases you might prefer a Sony A7R III or a A9, I mean, for the money, if you look at what you spend, I would say this is the best value you can get in Sony's lineup right now. It's a really good like overall performer for many different kind of situations, and I really love it. And I haven't even mentioned yet how great the video is on this camera, and that's something I also plan to explore a lot more. So that's it for this video. I hope you got something out of it. See you very soon again. Please press thumbs up if you like this video, and please subscribe if you aren't already subscribed. I think my next video will likely be about macro photography, something I really love. So see you soon again. Over and out.